What's up, everyone? We're back for another episode of Locked On Bucks, and Greece have navigated their way through the group phase undefeated, and now things are actually looking pretty nice on the road home as far as knockout opponents go. So we're going to discuss that, and then we're also going to talk a little bit about Dennis Schroder and Jordan Clarkson. They're two names that have been floated around a little bit in different circumstances. Do they make any sense for the Bucks? Let's have a chat about it.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Bucks. I'm your host, Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on this show every day, and also find some other stuff over at ESPN alongside me, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden. And today's episode is brought to you by Bet Online. Big weekend, NFL just getting started, and Bet Online has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. That's Bet Online, where the game starts. And I sent you a message the other day, Frank, and I said, our friends in Greece have taken over in this last little period as the highest percentage nation that is behind Locked On Bucks, particularly on YouTube. So we have to thank everyone for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or listen wherever you're catching Locked On Bucks. But it's fun. It's the off season. We've got basketball to watch. And Greece just finished the job. They got the job done today. Took care of Estonia, 90-69. Only 19 minutes for Giannis. Little mini ankle tweak there at the end, but the reports suggest, I certainly saw our friend Harris Stavru was tweeting that there's nothing to be too concerned about there. But another little 25-point, 19-minute effort from Giannis. His per 36 numbers have to be looking pretty good so far from Eurobasket.
Yeah, he had 25 points all in the first half today. I think he had 13 in the first quarter, I think 12 in the second quarter, and 41 points the other day. Luka maybe upping the ante a little bit. Luka drops in 47 points, second all-time in the Eurobasket. And I'll just note, over the two halves from the second half of the Ukraine game when he scored 23 points through the first half of this game against Estonia, Giannis, 48 points over those two games. He missed one shot, 9 out of 10 today, made another 6 out of 7 from the free throw line. According to Mike,
have you got the minutes?
In 19 minutes. And then, Estonia hung around a little bit in the first half. I didn't even know if he was going to play today. I thought maybe they might just rest him. But he obviously comes out and plays, starts the second half with Greece kind of firmly in control and picks up a couple of charges in quick succession, goes to the bench. I didn't realize that there was anything wrong with them. And then eventually saw a replay. Looked like he not turned his ankle, but maybe tweaked his ankle a little bit, his right ankle on the second charge, and didn't come back. The Greek coach asserted that, he was icing his knee and stuff just because basically we put him into his post-game routine because they were up by a million points. Obviously, again, in the grand scheme of injuries, obviously, an ankle tweak, not something, on the very high end of the concern scale, right? But we've seen Giannis obviously turn his ankles a couple times a year and miss games here and there because of this, right? Yeah. So it's not like a new thing. Again, I don't look at this as something where you're worried about, his long-term health per se. But again, this is why the first comment I always make is get through a game healthy. That's the biggest thing. And obviously not quite healthy coming out of that game, but with a couple of days off, Friday, Saturday, ahead of the game against the Czech Republic on Sunday, seems very unlikely that Giannis won't be able to play in that game. Tape it up. That's what the Greeks are going to say. We can't blame them. Undefeated group play. He's been playing awesome. And as we were just looking at before we started recording, the bracket, pretty much an ideal break of the bracket in a lot of ways. They get the Czech Republic on Sunday. They would have to play Germany, the hosts, or one of the hosts, in the quarters potentially. And then I think you had the longer list, Kane, but probably the most important thing is that Serbia and Slovenia are on the opposite side of the bracket. So I think Spain is the highest remaining seed that they could face in the semis. And Spain not as strong probably as you'd say as they have been in recent years. They still have the Hernan Bromez brothers, or Hernan Bromez's Billy and Juancho, and old hand Rudy Fernandez and all. But again, obviously not probably maybe having as much star power as they have had in years past, but they still finished top of their group too. So Spain obviously always a threat. So yeah, I mean, again, if you're a Greek fan and / a Bucks fan, we're all the same thing right now. You have to feel pretty good about getting through that group stage undefeated. Some close calls in those first couple games, but by the same token, they were the better team against um, Croatia and why am I forgetting who they played in Italy in the first two games. So took care of business and go undefeated. Giannis looks at the peak of his powers, threw down another just incredible dunk, just driving length of the court, basically against the set defense. That was the ironic part today, just like a Superman dunk among his many baskets today. A couple of mid-rangers, even hit like a rapid fire catch and shoot 3-pointer when he was really feeling himself, and capped off the first half with a kind of a fast break dunk after a Costas block. That was very nice. So yeah, Giannis, everything kind of was working, and tweaks his ankle, but 25 points in 19 minutes. Very impressive. And one little fun note here, 6 out of 7 from the foul line. He's shot over 80% from the free throw line in all 4 games that he's played in the Eurobasket. Why does that matter, Kane? What is the significance of that? Well, the last time he went 4 straight games of competitive basketball shooting better than 80% in 4 games in a row, December of 2017. Got to go back almost 5 full years for the last time that Giannis was that consistent from the foul line. So what does it mean for the coming Bucks season? I don't know. But always nice to see Giannis making free throws. Obviously last year, in many ways, kind of turned around a couple of down years from the foul line. So shout out to Giannis making some free throws, and shout out to Greece for taking care of business and setting themselves up about as well as they could coming out of the group stage.
Well, that's right. And if you go back to 2017, just a young whippersnapper I was over in Australia, and all I could do was dream about potentially hosting Locked On Bucks one day. And that reminds me, we just ticked over episode 1400 last episode, Frank. So just a few in the bank. We're on the road to 2,000. We also crossed 4,000 subscribers on YouTube as well.
All right.
So we appreciate that. We're on the climb there. More on the group stage when it comes to Greece, though, because it is just funny the way it works out. And this is why earlier in the games, the close game against Italy, close game against Croatia, perhaps not the most impressive fourth quarters of all time. That's why it really mattered. So we'll take a closer look at that after I talk about betonline.net, which is your number one source for all your pro and college football betting needs and sports info this season. Frank, who are the Packers playing?
The Vikings, right?
That sounds right. Divisional rivals. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean,
absolutely.
Arguably, I mean, especially given the Bears haven't been, good in forever. I feel like, not that the Vikings are awesome, but I feel like in some ways I take the Vikings rivalry more seriously than any of the other kind of historic rivals, with at least division rivals. It just feels like it's been too long since the Bears were at all kind of concerning, whereas the Vikings, have been typically a little friskier. So yeah, crossing my fingers that the Packers can pull out a win here to start the season against the hated Vikings.
Yes, definitely a rivalry matchup there. And speaking of the Bears, on betonline.net, I was just perusing the other day, and I saw that the Bears are actually a chance to have the worst record in the entire NFL, which we love to see here at Locked On Bucks. So you can find out all of your latest Football League developments, game matchups, news, and podcasts, including this year's opening week's games. BetOnline is also your continued source for all other sports wagering information, whether it's the NBA that's coming up here, potentially Eurobasket, MLB on the road to the postseason there as well. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. That's BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so I've got the bracket in front of me. So this is why it's interesting. So I referenced those two games that they played Croatia, they played Italy. They won both of those games by 4 points. And when we had Harris on the podcast and when we were talking about this tournament, we were looking ahead and saying, geez, it's going to be difficult to avoid both Slovenia and Serbia. And there was other results with those two nations that changed the standings as well. So you needed kind of a perfect storm. But in this situation, Greece go 5-0. They finish on top. And the poor old Ukraine, who finished second and had a pretty good group stage, it has to be said, they get Poland, but then they're going to have to go through Luka. And then they're going to have to go through Jokic if they win that game, if all the favorites win. And then you have Croatia, who actually finished third in the group with Greece. And they avoid Slovenia and Serbia in their section of the bracket there. So certainly I think this is the perfect result for Greece. And as you pointed to, Spain have been a powerhouse for a long time. It's not the classic Spain lineup, but there was no doubt from the start. The best position to be was just take care of business, win all those games. And they actually got to rest Giannis against Great Britain as well. So you have to say, a pretty perfect group stage, all things considered. And Frank's frozen. Looks like Frank could be frozen here. So I'm just going to continue on with the discussion here. So Czech Republic in a couple of days' time, as Frank mentioned, and then Germany potentially up next. And Frank's just sent me a message and he said his computer's blue screen. So I'm sure he'll be back with us in just a second. So Greece will potentially face Germany in the quarterfinals. And then you're looking at potentially Spain or Lithuania to get through the final. But I think when you look at this tournament as a whole, the big picture is that there are three guys in this tournament. Of course, Giannis is one of those. But when you have Nikola Jokic and you have Luka Doncic, there is three guys in this tournament, if you're any nation, that you know that they can absolutely tear apart your team. And we've seen it. Doncic has been scoring his 40 points. Giannis has been scoring his 40-plus points and scoring at just an incredible rate so far. So I think you have to look at this as the perfect scenario that Greece have been able to avoid those two teams to this point in time in the tournament, and we'll see how far it takes them. But I've been interested looking at the YouTube comments to see whether whether the Greek fans are feeling overly confident. And I think that there is a mix between the Greek fans that think that this team can seriously go all the way in this tournament. And then there is a section of Greek fans that are not as optimistic, and they understand that Giannis is the dominant force. But I look at a guy like Tyler Dorsey, who certainly early in the tournament had a couple of really important games. Sloukas has come into the team and been a valuable scorer as well. We saw Giannis, they were at a game. They were at a football game, a soccer game. I'm not sure exactly where they were. But there was a photo of Giannis and he was hugging Agravanis. And Agravanis has been important and come up with some big shots at times, even if it's not the prettiest execution. So I just think that this Greek team, there might not be secondary stars on this roster. And yes, the bulk of the work comes down to Giannis and what he's able to do for this team. But I think overall, when you look at the big picture, they've got nice pieces around him. It will potentially come down to the three-point shooting in these finals games. But I think as long as you've got Giannis, you have to feel like you're in a pretty good position in this tournament to at least medal. And Greek fans, let me know how you're feeling. But I just look at this bracket right now. And if you can get through the Czech Republic, who will be decent, the Germany in Berlin, I think the crowd is going to be pretty raucous. But I would say, even when Greece was playing Italy in the group stage, there are so many Giannis fans. There are Milwaukee Bucks jerseys all over these arenas. The fans are going absolutely wild. So I think there's going to be a lot of support for Giannis, particularly if Greece get on top early in that game. And then, you put yourself into the Final Four. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this goes. Now, speaking of Germany, One player that I think for a lot of NBA fans, it's been a little bit bizarre that this player has found himself on the outer and without a team. Dennis Schroder. Now, Greece might see Dennis Schroder in a couple of days' time if the results go that way. He's obviously someone that has some history with Bud, played under him in Atlanta. But I am curious to see whether Dennis Schroder is a guy that potentially finds his way onto a roster. And Frank's back. So Frank, I've just started the discussion about Dennis Schroder, but I asked you a question and I can't even remember what it was anymore. And I was actually thinking to myself, I don't think Frank has ever thought this deeply about a question I've asked him on a podcast, but if he wants to speak at any point in time, but at the point where your computer froze, you just had a really you were deep in thought. And it took me a few seconds to realize that you're actually frozen. But you said your computer blue screen, which is never a good feeling. So Dennis Schroder, are you surprised that he's not on a roster? Based on what we've seen in the NBA the last couple of years, and of course, everyone knows the story. This was a man that turned down a significant amount of money. I think it was 80 plus million.
Yeah. Man. And I think I think there was like some attempt to make it seem like he didn't turn that down.
Well, I mean, yes, I would be trying to cover that up as well.
I forget exactly how he tried to like make it seem like I didn't see the contract. It's like, dude, man, bad move. Yeah, Schroeder's tough, right? I mean, he's a guy that Bud coached, his first few seasons in the NBA. So I think that's one of the interesting kind of dimensions for all this from a Bucks perspective. I mean, I remember a couple years ago before the Drew Holiday trade, wondering, is Dennis Schroeder the Bledsoe replacement back then? And he ends up going to the Lakers. I believe that trade happened before the Bucks made the Holiday trade. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, what are the Bucks going to do now, given that Schroeder he was in OKC at the time, was coming off actually probably his best season, essentially playing as like a 6-man, complimenting Chris Paul. And, one of those interesting sort of sliding doors things, obviously at this point, in the sense that he goes to LA, he's okay there, right? Not that, I don't know, he wasn't the reason they lost to the Phoenix Suns, but didn't entirely distinguish himself, doesn't agree to a contract extension, and then goes into free agency and has to eventually settle for a 1-year mid-level deal with the Celtics. And it's like, oh, the Celtics get a steal, right? Well, the Celtics get Schroeder just for the mid-level, right? They could use a shot creator kind of at the point guard spot to complement Marcus Smart. And then what happens last year? Well, Celtics are kind of screwing around for half the year. And then when they basically decide that they're just not going to play Dennis Schroeder anymore, then they take off, end up dumping him with the Rockets, taking back Daniel Tice's contract, which was not a good contract, and sort of marooning Schroeder in Houston, where, again, they said all the right things about like, oh, they're not going to buy him out, like, oh, he's going to compliment the young guys, and well, maybe they'll bring him back next year, whatever, right? So yeah, I mean, again, after last year, I mean, he already went through this once where he basically sat out free agency thinking there might be a bigger offer, and then had to settle for the taxpayer mid-level a year ago. And after another year disappointment, obviously no team looked at him and said, this is a guy that we want to bring in. And I think the probably the issues start with just the perception of him as, a bad locker room guy. Again, there's, a history of him not meshing well necessarily with teammates. And again, could a team like the Bucks that has about as strong of a locker room and culture be able to fit a guy like that in better than most? Yeah, I think so, right? I think if you brought a guy like that in with a clear sense of, hey, you're going to be a bench guy and you're going to have to compete with, Javon Carter and George Hill, and there's not going to be anything guaranteed. First off, that would probably be a barrier to getting him to sign a contract. Again, unless it was really kind of there really just was nothing else where he felt like he could showcase his talents more. And, at this point, he's late 20s. It's not like he's like 35 and just looking for a mid-level minimum contract, right? I'm sure he has dreams of reestablishing himself and getting paid again. So again, is there an angle for the Bucks here where, they can make a play for him and maybe he ends up being a nice spark plug off the bench? I think certainly in a regular season sense, I could see that. I think the concern obviously with him is just, in the playoffs, as bad as things were for the Bucks in the second round against the Celtics without Chris Middleton and the need for shot creation. Yeah, I mean, again, in the village of the blind, the one-eyed Dennis Schroder, I probably could have been of some use offensively, but defensively, he would have been even worse than certainly anybody that the Bucks were rolling out there. I mean, I'd say probably worse than Grayson Allen was, as bad as Grayson was as well. He's smaller than Grayson, not exactly known for his defensive commitment. So, so he's an interesting player. Just again, given his scoring ability, some pick and roll ability, but not a great shooter. Right, has had some decent years shooting the three ball, but generally has not been a consistent 3-point shooter. So we'll see. I think some speculation that maybe he's hoping a strong showing at the Eurobasket might drive some more interest in him from an NBA perspective. But as a dice roll, I think, I mean, I'd be okay with it, right? Bud knows what he'd be getting, right? I mean, it's been a few years since he coached him, but he knows him about as well as any coach. He's coached him longer than any other coach in the league. And I think the other upside of this is if you're signing a guy for the minimum, which is the most the Bucks could offer, and which he's probably looking at regardless of where he signs, if things don't work out, you just cut him, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if and that's not cheap to the Bucks because of, again, the tax impact. If you waive him and he's not picked up by another team on waivers, right? It's dead salary, but at least you don't have like a $10 million contract that you have to trade because you can't waive that. So I don't want to say low risk, high risk, low risk, high reward. I think there's a little bit of risk, and there's probably like maybe a decent amount of reward, but I think it's more of a regular season one. And again, I don't. But that's the other thing too, is like I don't know that the Bucks desperately need Dennis Schroder for the regular season either. But certainly his shot creation and ability to score would be an upgrade over the kind of the other guys that they have at those backup guard spots. And the other thing too is this is where the luxury of Drew Holiday is important. Drew can play with whoever, right? I mean, he can't make Dennis Schroder a good defender, but given Drew's shot size, he can obviously play with a guy like that, or just have him as his backup. And so I think it's been, the Schroder to me is an interesting counterpoint. There's a few different guys that I think are interesting to look at in regards to this, right? We heard this rumor, and while I was blue screening, I don't know if you brought up the Jordan Clarkson rumor. That's sort of where we think we're kind of starting, because there was this Brett Siegel, who writes at SI, reference that the Bucks were among the teams that inquired with the Jazz after the Gobert trade about Jordan Clarkson, which is a while back now, right? Like, it's not like this is like, oh, last week the Bucks were making offers for Jordan Clarkson. That was not what was reported, and nobody else has reported this from everything I gather. So Bucks kicked the tires on a Jordan Clarkson deal, a couple months ago at this point. That doesn't necessarily scream that they're banging down the Jazz's door to get Jordan Clarkson. And again, very different situation than Dennis Schroder. I think Jordan Clarkson's better than Dennis Schroder. I'd rather have Jordan Clarkson than Dennis Schroder, but some of the same issues, right? Score first guard, never going to be confused for a guy who's going to defend at a high level. Same concerns if you're in a series against the Celtics that he's not going to be able to hold up. But here's the flip side. Would you rather trade, at a minimum, Grayson Allen and George Hill? And I realize people aren't going to be sad about getting rid of George Hill, but I think Grayson Allen's still an asset. I would rather have Grayson Allen on my team than not on my team. So do you want to have, for instance, Grayson Allen and Dennis Schroder, or would you rather have just Jordan Clarkson, right? That's a little bit of sort of like the hypothetical trade-off, like as we play around with these sorts of potential moves here in early September. And again, I'm not sold that the Bucks make any more moves before training camp, but those are kind of the options they have. And And I think then the other, and when we think about like other potential things that they could do, I know you talked, and I think it was you and Camille maybe earlier or you and Justin, I can't remember who you were talking to when you did it, but when Eric Bledsoe was bought out by the Trailblazers, well, Eric Bledsoe is still a free agent too. He's kind of the opposite, right? Like we all know he can't be trusted offensively in the playoffs, but defensively, you'd expect him to obviously give still a much better effort than what you'd get from Jordan Clarkson or Dennis Schroder. So these are kind of like the very imperfect options that you can weigh at this time of year. Do you want an Eric Bledsoe, who we've seen before when he was younger and in a better stage of his career, obviously was not the guy in the answer as a starter in a much more reduced role? What would that look like versus a guy like Dennis Schroder, who's much more of that offensive scorer, but brings the defensive concerns? Or do you try to get maybe a better version of Dennis Schroder, arguably with Jordan Clarkson, but have to give up stuff to get it? Again, at this point in the summer, I have a hard time feeling strongly about any of these things. I wouldn't mind adding a guy like one of those dudes with a 15th spot, because again, it's mostly a tax question at this point. But there's obviously major reason to not expect any of them to really be guys again that would impact sort of the playoffs, right? Which ultimately is what matters for the Bucks.
Well, that's why I think it's so interesting at this point. And that's why even the signing of Javon Carter last year at the time that they did for really nothing was fascinating, because typically when you're in a position where you're the Bucks at this point in time, it's like, are you really actually getting a playoff player that's just not signed? And Clarkson's a little bit different because you would have to trade. I also just think maybe it was the Jazz that said, well, we've had Grayson Allen before. We don't really, we're just going to hang out to near playoff time and see if there's a team that gets desperate and wants to give us a first for Jordan Clarkson. Who knows? But I think George Hill's health, plays a big part in this story as well. Because, if he's still got a broken neck or spinal issues, then the chances are that he's not going to last the season, and he's not going to be a guy that's going to be a huge difference maker in the postseason as well. So it'll be interesting to see what the Bucks want to do at the point guard position. But I got to get the hell out of here, Frank, because I get a meeting starting in 2 minutes. But I think for our listeners, and you pointed to it, Frank, George Hill has become a bit of a whipping boy at the moment with the Bucks fans. They don't exactly love George Hill. I personally think it's a little bit harsh because clearly he was playing through injury. Should he have been playing? That's a big question. But let us know what you want to do at the backup point guard position, because I do think that that's the number one spot with the question now, Frank.
Yeah. So tell us in the comments / tweet at us / whatever. Send smoke signals, email. George Hill versus Eric Bledsoe versus Dennis Schroder versus trading for Jordan Clarkson. We'll give those as your options, and we haven't even talked about the other Jordan Nwora recently, but I don't know. Jordan Nwora floating around in the ether just seems less and less likely to come back. But maybe I'm wrong.
Bustling sign and trade market for Jordan Nwora. Did I? All right. Check out the Locked On NBA podcast. They got you covered for everything going on around the league. And we'll be back when it's knockout basketball and Eurobasket. That's the most important point. Greece and the Czech Republic playing in a couple of days' time. As they say on TV, check your local guides. I can't be giving out all these around the world.
ESPN Plus in America. Your employer, Kane.
Great company. All right. Let's leave it there. Have a lovely weekend. We'll talk to you guys in a couple of days.